Once again, thank you all for joining. My name is Joey Asher. I am president of Speechworks. And this webinar today is going to be running down the worst public speaking advice out there. I shouldn't say it's the worst, but it's what we would consider odd public speaking advice and stuff that you probably shouldn't do. And we're going to talk about it not only in terms of what you shouldn't do, but also conversely what you should do. So I don't want you to take away from this as these are the 5 things I should never do. I also want you to take away from this things that you should do. This webinar was actually inspired by a conversation I had with a client not too long ago. A woman during a workshop. This was obviously far enough ago so it wasn't during COVID. We were actually doing live in-person workshops at this time. And she comes up to me and she says, here's the public speaking advice that my boss gave me. She said, my boss told me, and by the way, it was he said, you look really good in red. All of your speeches should be given with you wearing red. That was the public speaking advice that she got from her boss. And while who knows, maybe red was a good color on her, I just don't think that's particularly helpful advice. Telling somebody what they should or shouldn't wear is not really the kind of advice. I think you should obviously dress professionally, but saying things like this is the color you should always wear seems to me odd advice and is not particularly helpful in making somebody be a better communicator. And so we're going to talk about 5 things that we think are sort of odd pieces of public speaking advice that I think you should probably not do. By the way, as we go forward, go to the chat box, ask questions, argue with me. I would really love for you to do that. Those of you who've been on these calls before know that we want to try and make them as interactive as we can. And usually everybody sort of complies with that. So we're going to count down the top 5. And the first one is coming up is the one that Steve Arkon came up with. Steve, are you on? Are you on the call? I can't see you.
I am.
There you are, Steve. So tell me, what is this? What is the nature of this advice? People, go ahead and give the advice, and then we're going to talk about it.
I think it stems from maybe early on in my career, giving speeches and being nervous or having anxiety about it. So this was maybe a trick or a tool to help you overcome that anxiety. I think if you have anxiety, which is natural, this might just add more confusion to you and mess you up even more. So that's why I don't really want to look at anyone and imagine them in their underwear. I don't know that would help me feel more confident. So that was one that just really stuck out when I saw the meeting invite for today.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a good one. And, it is definitely advice that's been around for a long time, which is imagine your audience naked. And that somehow is going to help you feel more comfortable, feel less nervous, feel less intimidated. And I get the idea of it. And it's kind of funny. But I don't think in real life it's really helpful. If you really, the reality is, in our judgment, if you want to overcome your anxiety, there is really, in our judgment, primarily one thing you need to do. One thing more than anything else, and it's not a particularly revolutionary concept. You've got to practice your presentations. That's it. It's interesting. There is a performance psychologist in Atlanta named Dr. Megan Nair. I don't know if anybody ever heard of Dr. Nair. She is a really fascinating person. I've interviewed her a couple of times for articles, and I think I've even had her on a podcast. And she was actually an Olympic caliber diver. Olympic diver. She was actually on the team. She was, I think, a world champion level diver. She was actually on the team that actually did not get to go to the Olympics in 1980. Those of you who are around long enough remember that we boycotted the Olympics that year. And so she did not get to go. So it was a real disappointment for her. But she spent her career as a psychologist teaching people how to perform and performance psychology. And she says the most important thing to overcome your nerves in terms of, athletes and divers and anybody who has any sorts of performance anxiety, it's all about developing muscle memory. It's all about practicing over and over and over again. And the reality is that most people who don't practice, most people who get really, really nervous, they don't really practice that much. And they don't practice very much, and they don't really know how to practice properly. So here's a quick sort of overview as to how to practice properly. The most important thing is to say the words out loud from beginning to end without stopping, like it's a play. That's the idea. You have to say the whole thing out loud, because that allows you to develop that muscle memory that Dr. Nyer, that Megan Nyer talked about. Brian says the key is to have good transitional sentences to take. Brian, could you go ahead and unmute? This is a really interesting idea here. Unmute, tell us what you mean here in terms of, you're talking about in terms of overcoming anxiety. Is that right?
Well, I think it goes back to practice, right? Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you great.
Okay, good. Yeah. As I went through our training when we were at Choice Point, the key thing that I always do in my presentations is to make sure that we always have 3 points, right? Your point, your plan, and your proof, right? But as you start to make the transition, 2 things that I do in my practice is to make sure I have a good sentence that takes my brain to the next point that I want to make, right? Because not only does it help me go from a service solution to a technology point or something along those lines, it also takes the client or the people you're presenting to that too. So I spend a tremendous amount of time preparing for, no different than you do with your hook. It's always, making some sort of statement that's not on the slide that sets the stage for what you're getting ready to present before you start presenting your solution, right?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting point. I think, Brian, if I understand it correctly, what you're saying is that, once again, you have certain moments that you know are critical, and you're really planning specifically what you're going to say at those moments. Is that right?
That's right. But how often, the worst thing you can do when you're presenting is you don't make that transition and you start reading your slide, right? So right. That's your crutch that gives you a chance to think for a second, right? I mean, I've always talked about implementation of anything being a problem. And one of my transitional is, making a conversion to a new solution can be the best thing or the worst thing you've ever made, right? But we know how to do this. And the point is experience. And then I start talking about experience and putting together the proof elements behind that. So to me, that has always been a key to the practice for me. Another thing is underlying key words so that you're not, because typically I've always got my notes in front of me, but I'm always underlying key words because as you practice, it triggers the memory functions where you're underlying 1 or 2, or you put in black in your speaker's notes, and that triggers your brain to start that point, right?
Yeah, well, it's a really good point, but I think the fundamental point, once again, is don't go in there and try and imagine everybody sitting around naked. What we want you to do is we want you to practice your presentations. That's a lot more effective than imagining people without their clothes on. Though, I don't know, I guess that can be entertaining in its own way. So let's move on to the second. Let's move on to the second piece of advice that we hear quite a bit, actually, and we don't think it's great advice. We hear people say, "I'm always told that that I speak too fast. I should slow down." Now, here's the thing about this advice. Generally, you don't speak too fast. In fact, it's virtually impossible for you to speak too fast. I mean, there's been actually some science around this. People studied the fastest talkers, and they don't speak faster than about 140, 150 words a minute. The human ear can actually perceive 300 words a minute. So you're not speaking too fast. What you probably should be doing is pausing. So a lot of people, if they try and slow down and they speak really, really slow, they start to sound hesitant. And that's really not so good. You don't want to sound hesitant. You want to sound like you're energized. In fact, a lot of times we'll tell people to speak even faster because when you speak faster, that actually adds energy. It makes you seem more energized. So don't slow down. Don't slow yourself down. If you're one of those people that people say you speak too fast, instead, what we would urge you to think about is not slowing down, but everyone's throwing in a pause to let your audience sort of process your ideas. So that's our second piece of advice associated with not so good advice. The not so good advice is slow down. You're speaking too fast. Don't slow down. Just throw in some pauses. All right. I want to go to the next one because this one came up with, let's see, who Wally mentioned this issue around jokes. Christine said jokes. The thing about jokes, a lot of people say this. They say, I've always been told I should start with a joke. Or I've actually had people come to me and say, can you make me funny? I want to start with a joke. In a business setting, I don't think jokes are great. I don't think you should start with a joke. I don't think that people come to business presentations to hear jokes. I think that they come in to solve problems. And I think the other problem with jokes is there's all sorts of problems with the jokes themselves. In fact, I actually have put together a few rules that will, if you can pass these rules, okay, you can use a joke. So here are the rules. There's several prongs. Prong number one, you can use a joke if the joke is funny. Okay, so the problem with this is that the vast majority of these jokes that you hear people say, they're not funny. So that's number one. Number two, you can use a joke if it's not offensive. In a business setting, you don't want to tell a joke that's potentially offensive. Now, here's the problem. If the joke is not offensive, that eliminates most of the good jokes. Most of the good jokes are kind of offensive. I like jokes. I'm a fan of offensive jokes. I will tell offensive jokes while I'm, having beers with friends. But in a business context, it's really not a good idea. Don't tell jokes. If you can't tell an offensive joke, you can't tell any jokes because most of them are offensive, at least at some level. The third prong is the joke needs to be relevant. And most of these jokes are not relevant. The people tell they're just sort of one-liner throwaways. They're not funny. The final thing is you can tell a joke if it passes all the other things. If it passes all three of those, if it's relevant, if it's funny and non-offensive. If you can pass those three, then go ahead, tell your joke. But it's a pretty high bar. So I would avoid jokes. Just get right to it. Tim Talmadge and I were chatting before about the best way to start these presentations. And in general, start with the issue. What's the client's concern? What is your listener's concern? And just get right to that. We think that's the best way to start there. I want to pause right here. Does anybody have any questions or comments or arguments? So I love it when people argue with me, by the way. That sort of makes me happy. Anybody want to take a moment and push back on the joke issue? A lot of people like to tell jokes, and I'm just not a big fan. One of the things we talked about in this, as we were getting ready to do this, is that people were worried. Well, what if you bring up something and people really want to do that? And I said, well, I guess they'll just argue with me. Karen made the point that knowing your audience is helpful. Karen, why don't you go ahead and unmute and tell me what you mean by that? I think I completely agree with that. I think your point is that there may be the circumstance, if you understand your audience well, that the joke is okay.
Yeah, I've presented to both large rooms of people, just introducing my product, and just at trade shows, we get 15 or 20 minutes to highlight some of the new things that we might have going on. And I have started with a joke a number of years ago. I haven't used this one in quite a while, but I think it was one of the very first. And my boss said, just like you had said, picture your audience naked. So I started with, okay, I said, well, I just want to let you know that I'm a little nervous. So I'm picturing you all naked. So if you all will stay seated behind your desks, I'd really appreciate it. You know, and then when I finished, I did my presentation, talked a little bit about some stuff and what I'm selling and you know, want to be remembered type thing. And I said, okay, so now I'm finished. You can all put your clothes back on now, and I'll talk to you guys later. You know, that kind of thing. But
Well,
that,
so-
you know, but starting in small rooms, totally different.
I think that's pretty, you know, I have to say that I just laughed at that joke, and that was a genuine laugh. So I thought that was kind of funny, actually. And so not bad, not bad. So, you know, there's exceptions to all these rules. There's exceptions to all these rules. But I just in general, I'm not a big fan of the humor at the beginning of a business presentation. I mean, if I want to hear humor, I'll go to a comedy club or something like that. I think in business, we're not usually, but your Karen, I think is right. Is it depends on the context and the personality. Blythe makes another really good point here. Blythe, why don't you go ahead and unmute and talk about this?
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually had someone do a series of impressions during a presentation, and it was everything from celebrities to Mickey Mouse. And it was really entertaining until this person started impersonating colleagues and team members. And people got really offended. This person did not reach out to them ahead of time and say they were going to do that. They didn't say, hey, this is for, you know, whatever. It just was really off topic. It was random, and people found it to be very, very offensive. And I agree with you. I like offensive jokes are funny, and, you know, we laugh at comedians and things like that. But when no one's prepared for it, when you don't know your audience, you can really, really put yourself in a very inappropriate situation over something that you intended to be funny. Well, good intentions never did good for anybody. Everybody has good intentions. That was a big lesson, a big takeaway for me.
I think it's a really good point. This idea of being careful about making fun of people. And I've seen this a lot, actually. I've seen this quite a bit where people think they're being funny by teasing people, you know, teasing people in the audience. You know, I've seen people sort of make fun of people's shirt, you know, like they look at this shirt and they say, yeah, that's an interesting color shirt you're wearing there, Joey. As if, I'm not even sure how to take that. You know, a lot of people sort of are like, well, do you really dislike my shirt? Are you joking? And even though I think that, you know, people might think it's funny, I think it's just best to steer clear. Let's just talk about the business at hand. That's why we're here. We're not here. Gary likes my shirt color. Thank you. Thank you, Gary. I feel much better, but this is kind of the point, is that we got to be careful with all this kind of, people can get their feelings hurt, and it's really not necessary. It's just not necessary. Okay, let's go to the next one. Let's see what we've talked about. Let's see. I got these all written down. Here's one. Now this one might be controversial, because I've heard people really disagree with me on this one, but I'm going to stand by my guns on this one. Put questions in the parking lot. That's the piece of advice that we often get. If there's a question that comes out of line or out of turn, put it in the parking lot. I think this is horrible advice. Now, I will tell you, there are people out there, particularly facilitators, people in the training world, that love this. I'm against it. I have to be honest with you. I'm against it. And the reason I am is I feel like if somebody raises a question and they want to know an answer, they don't want their question to go in the parking lot. They want to know what the answer is. And so I feel like you should answer the question. You know, I feel like, you know, if I've raised my hand, this has happened before. I've been in a session, I've raised my hand, I'm asking the question. It was something that the facilitator was going to get at later. And he says, I'll tell you what, Joey, I'm going to take your question and put it in the parking lot. I just don't think it's a good idea. I don't want to go into the parking lot. I want the answer to my question. Even if you feel like you're going to talk about it later, give them the short answer. Give them the short answer to the question, and then say, and we'll talk about it later. But I just think this idea of putting people off when the audience members have a question, answer the question at the moment it's asked. Because I think the reason that we're here is to help the people that are in our audiences. And if they have a question, you should help them immediately. Let's see. We've got a couple of more comments that are coming in. Let's see. Yeah, well, yeah, I say what Wally is saying is give a short answer and then more later. Yeah, I agree with that. Okay, Karen, you're sort of okay. So here, Laura. Laura, go ahead and unmute. Tell me what your point of view. Laura, I'm glad somebody's arguing. You're not really arguing with it, but you're sort of giving a different point of view.
I'm not arguing with you. It's more from teaching classes, presentations where you've got an hour and you've got certain content you're trying to get through. And I was once teaching a class and a member of the class began to engage me and I responded to him. And then by the end of it, everybody else in the class was so angry because he was a contrarian and a very nice person sort of lost it and said, "You always do this. You ruin our classes." I didn't have any way to know that going in. And so I guess if you can answer it quickly and then say, "I can't deal with your follow-up right now," or whatever, then maybe there's a way to do that. So
yeah, so I think that you've hit on what I would suggest in that circumstance. I mean, you're absolutely right. First of all, it does depend on the format. It does depend on everything always depends on everything. But I will say that as a general rule, it's a good idea. If somebody's going to start arguing with you and sort of get into a sort of a back and forth, there's nothing wrong with saying, you're raising all sorts of issues. Let me get to that later. I want to keep going. But at the very least, my general policy is give them the quick answer. Give them the quick, short answer and then go from there. But I do think that it's always a good idea to you always everything sort of has to be I live in all of my advice with depending on the circumstances, because there's always a circumstance where you might find, no, it's a better idea to do this. Let's see. I think I've covered 4 of them. Okay, here's the last one. And I think this is a really good one. This is a piece of advice I've heard people say all the time, and I really hate this piece of advice. The piece of advice goes like this. You don't want to over prepare. I've heard this. You don't want to practice too much. I completely do not understand this. I do not understand this at all. I do understand that maybe if you practice it so much that you've memorized it and it comes out stiff, but this notion that you can over prepare makes no sense to me. Excuse me, Coach Saban. I don't want to go practice today. I don't feel like I need to over prepare for this. Coach, though I shouldn't give football references for people who are not football fans. Coach Saban, Nick Saban of the Alabama Crimson Tide, considered one of the great coaches. I'm sure he would never say, "Yeah, don't over prepare." I'm sure he would never say yes. He would say you have to over prepare. In my experience, the people that are the best presenters are the ones that practice a lot. And this is over and over again. We see this over and over again. The fact of the matter is, I would be out of a job. I would definitely be out of a job if everybody just started practicing their presentations a lot, because practice by itself makes you substantially better. So when I hear people say things like, you don't want to over prepare, usually that's an excuse to me that says is another way of saying, I don't have time to prepare, so I just like to wing it. And of course, you don't want to over prepare. No. Yeah, over prepare. Please over prepare. Practice too much. Practice so much that if a bomb went off, you could still deliver your presentation. Because my experience has been the people that do that practice a lot, they're always better than the people that don't practice. Always, every single time. So that's the main thing I would say about that. Anybody want to argue with me on that one? I mean, I've heard people will argue with me on this one. And I welcome you to push back, argue me, tell me you completely disagree with me. Say, Joey, you're all wet. Anybody want to argue? I know I've taken such a strong one. Karen says, especially with virtual presentation. Why is it more important with I agree with this, by the way. Karen, why is it more important with virtual?
So we've been having some presentations, some education training, and the Teams meetings, you can't show your presentations, they can't see the slides, something's not working. And if you have practiced your presentation, the slides are supposed to be there just to enhance your presentation, you're not talking to enhance your slides. So when you over prepare, you don't need the slides. You can still do your presentation without the slides. And it's nothing has been, I mean, I've been so many presentations where something doesn't work, but because I've been prepared, I can still do it. And I sweat a little, but I don't sweat as much.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good point, right? This happens all the time. It happens in virtual presentations, but it happens in, actual shown up in-person presentations as well, right? With the technology doesn't work, your laptop runs out of electricity, runs out of power, whatever, stuff goes wrong. And if you've really practiced your message well, you're not going to need those slides. I also just would point out in virtual presentations, it seems like stuff goes wrong more often. Just because of technology and all the other stuff that we're relying on. Then the internet will go out and all sorts of weird stuff will happen. So yeah, it's a really, really important point. So thank you there for that, Karen. Okay, well, we're just about done. Does anybody have any final questions, comments, or thoughts before we wrap up our Friday afternoon webinar? How do you convince somebody that they need, this is Shelley asking, how do you convince somebody that they need to prepare when they believe they are great at winging it? So this is a really good question. A lot of people do. They think they're great at winging it. What I would do is I would record them. I would show them what they look like. Okay. I would record them, showing them, and then have them practice it and let them decide which is better.
That's a great idea.
Yeah. Record them. They think they're great. Okay, fine. Let's see it. Let's see you just wing it. See how you do. I guarantee you they're not going to be nearly as good as they think they are. I know there are tons of people that think they're great at winging it, but inevitably the messages get lost. They haven't really thought their messages out well, and so as a result, the people that do wing it pretty well are usually these natural salespeople. These people, Brian, am I right about this? The natural sellers. These guys who have really, or I shouldn't say guys and gals, men and women who sort of seem to have sort of a natural gift of gab. They tend to do pretty well. They do better in general, but even those guys don't usually have a very clean message. So that's what I would say about all that. All right, well, it's 12:30. I want to thank you all for joining the call. Once again, these were the 5 pieces of bad public speaking advice. And we've recorded this. So if you're interested in listening to it again, and I can't imagine you not wanting to listen to this multiple times, you'll get a chance to because we will send this all out to you. So thank you all. Have a great weekend. Have a safe weekend. And we'll see you next time. Thank you all very much.